So I should just say as a way of starting, I'm at the beginning of this project, or 25 quarter of the way through, and so I'm really looking forward to suggestions and ideas, even about the title, protected spaces. But I'll get to this theme of protection in a second. So I just wanted to start with an origin story. This project really began in April of 2018 when there was what protests broke out at Starbucks, a Starbucks store in the center of Philadelphia. And what happened was two Black men walked into the store. They were waiting to meet a colleague. And as they waited, they asked the attendant behind the counter, a barista in Starbucks kind of vocabulary, if they could use the bathroom. And the person said no, they couldn't unless they bought something. And when they refused to buy something, they called the police. And the police came and arrested these two men for trespassing. And this triggered a protest and a long season of protests in the United States over Black Lives Matter. And part of what they were doing, right, was talking about racial profiling in America. They were talking about the way in which Black men, particularly in public spaces, were vulnerable. But it also occurred to me, and what I was really interested in, I had written about bathrooms in my book about Starbucks and about access to bathrooms. I really was also interested in this as a problem of public bathrooms and really of public space in America, and of the kind of dearth of public space in America that kind of accentuated this problem, and the way in which public space had always been divided. And so I really just began poking around, kind of thinking about the public bathroom as a starting point from this. And this kind of led to, my kind of summer and research project, which entails taking pictures of bathrooms. And this is a bathroom in Paris. And this is a bathroom I want to come back to in the train station in St. Louis. And actually, I want us to think for a second about the ornateness of this space, because again, it's something I want to come back to, really the investment in this space in a 19th century bathroom. And again, I think if you know the kind of landscape of the US, that this is in St. Louis is probably not surprising. And in a railroad station in St. Louis that itself is pretty dormant. There's not much the train station has been sort of privatized. These early bathrooms were called comfort stations. This is on the Ocean City Boardwalk in New Jersey, kind of near where I spend a lot of time in the summer. But again, this we can talk about a little bit about kind of access to bathrooms is something I really want to talk about it as we speak. This is in Angers, but about the kind of male use, the way in which the public is often defined by male space, right? The ability to kind of quickly use a kind of bathroom or a urinal. Another kind of fixture of kind of contemporary European life, right? The kind of pay toilet. This is from Williamsburg and Brooklyn, the kind of making up for this space. This is something I'll come back to about sex segregation in bathrooms, but a picture from an older one. This might be the most famous public bathroom in America. It's in Bryant Park, right next to the New York Public Library, a place that the city invested in. And I think two things that we could come back to again is obviously the flowers, but the attendant as a kind of important kind of factor. Another kind of bathroom space, and then we'll kind of get back to graffiti. But if you want to send me images, I'd be more than happy to get them, right? And a kind of documentary project. I sort of have been involved in this project of documenting bathrooms and also mass as public waste in America. I don't know if the same phenomenon is happening in France, but the more masking there is, the more mass that end up on the streets as kind of garbage and trash. And I'm kind of intrigued by that just phenomenon. So let me just sort of talk about what I want to do for the next kind of 30 minutes or so. And that is this is a preliminary research report. And over the last kind of year and a half, and this has been affected by COVID, I've been doing research on bathrooms. And I started by kind of doing an initial newspaper search, which many of us do. And I started to do some research into archives, but then those archives were closed. And really for the last, 9 months or so, I've been confined to my room here in Philadelphia and using newspapers.com to do research into bathrooms, which in and of itself, I think is going to be an interesting problem. It's created this kind of multiplicity for me and an ability to kind of expand the project across the United States in a broad way that I don't think I could have done otherwise. But it also means I've been really hostage to newspaper sources. And so we can maybe talk about what that means. But what I want to do for you today is sort of kind of use this metaphor. I'm about a third of the way through this project and I'm beginning to make piles. In other words, beginning to see trends in my research, beginning to see kind of ideas kind of begin to accumulate into piles. And the metaphor here, I'm old enough that I began my first book literally using note cards. And when I first, got back from my research, I, sort of began to stack these note cards into piles that were themes, piles that were chapters, piles that were the beginning of the architecture of a book. And so really what I want to talk about today is my piles. What's in those piles, how they sort of suggest an initial way to organize a longer project about public bathrooms. And so again, this is sort of the metaphor that I want to use. And the structure that I'm thinking about, and I want you again in your head to think about that bathroom in St. Louis. And in some ways, some of the kind of other bathrooms that I showed you is a story about the rise and fall of the public bathroom in the United States. This is the kind of, at least the arc of the narrative as I see it. And I want to kind of complicate this as I go along. And it's not a sort of necessarily a kind of lamentable declension narrative, but it is a story of there were a lot of public bathrooms at one time in the United States. I discovered kind of pretty quickly, and there's less now. And so how do I explain that, right? Just really, how am I explaining that change over time? That's the kind of structure that at least I'm playing around with right now. And as you'll see, not everything's going to fit into this. And so I might need some help thinking about where some stuff goes. So I also wanted to just start with some kind of initial observations about the bathroom. Some of these won't be surprising, but essentially, right, this is a story of boundary making. The bathroom is a way in which kind of racial, sexual, and cultural boundaries are made. And I think this is probably pretty universal. This is not a particularly American story in that case. And I want to suggest that the bathrooms are built really to kind of create these boundaries, maintain these boundaries, and contest these boundaries. But the other thing I want to suggest, and this is that the bathroom is not just any public space. It's not a park, it's not a library. It is actually the prerequisite for entering public space. You can't enter public space, you can't leave your home unless you have access to a bathroom. And I think that why this makes it so important, right, is it becomes the place that people fight to get access to, but it also becomes the place that people try and make others not visible in public. And so again, I think this is a particular kind of public space. And what gives it its power, I think, is the possibility of humiliation. The possibility, right, of kind of embarrassment and humiliation if you don't have access to this. And the documents I've been reading a lot about this that have kind of provided some insight into it is a fair number of kind of memoirs of Jim Crow. And in those memoirs of Jim Crow, kind of Black Americans from the first half of the 20th century talk about how they need to know where bathrooms are before they leave the house. It becomes a map of the city for them and becomes a way in which they mark how far they can go. The other group that really marks and sort of charts out bathrooms in this way, again, I think kind of helping me think about this, is the trans community, we talk a lot about in memoirs and discussions about either not using public bathrooms for fear of physical violence, um, or about how they need to map them out before they go anywhere. And this again is underlines my point here, is that the public bathroom is the access point to the public. This is the argument I kind of want to make. And as such, right, it's a place of protest and resistance. People who trying to stave off change will fight those battles at the bathroom door. People trying to enter the public sphere will also fight those battles at the bathroom door. So those are some of my initial thoughts that, again, we can come back to. So this is the last kind of setup piece here. The theme that I want to play with today, and a theme that I'm going to talk a fair amount about, I think, you know, one of the things I'll talk a lot about in the book is about the idea of protection. And I want to argue here that the rise of the bathroom was really about kind of creating protection for some people. And I want to also suggest that the idea of protection has this kind of quality of universalism that's never sort of actualized in public, right? But it's this sort of promise of, right, of universalism that, you know, is out there, but it also is a way in which protection is that some people are going to be protected and other people aren't. Some people are going to be more citizens than others. And this idea of protection, I want to sort of say lastly, is key to the rise and fall of the bathroom. In other words, in many ways, the bathroom is built to protect a certain group of people in public, and then they're taken apart to protect people as well. And so we'll come back. It's also a theme that sort of shapes this at least tentative narrative that I have going on. Okay, so part one, which is the rise part as I see it. And, you know, as historians, right, again, we're interested in origin stories. We're interested in sort of cause. And really the rise of the public bathroom in the United States, there are some early antecedents to it, built by railroads, built really urinals for men in public. But the real kind of public bathroom, it kind of starts in the 1890s, and the whys are pretty kind of simple but important. I mean, one is obviously kind of increased urbanization. This is a period of kind of mass urbanization in the United States, where the scale and size of cities is going to kind of explode. It's also the period, right, as you know, early feminist historians remarked and others, of you have a separation between home, work, and leisure being like another important part of this urban landscape, right? I think a third thing that really happens and sort of catalyzes the kind of development of the public bathroom is the increased number of women, particularly middle-class women, right? Women of color, working class women had been in public or had worked before this, but really have large numbers of middle-class women as shoppers, as consumers of leisure, and, you know, increasingly when they're younger, as workers in public. There's also, and this is all kind of coming together at the same time, a real emphasis on sanitation. This is the advent of the germ theory and fears about public health. And I think this last thing, which will become really important, is, and it's related to all of these things, are there really at the very moment this happened, there's also new concerns with bodily privacy, Victorian values of bodily privacy. And so part of what you should see here is some of the tensions that are in these things that are going to lead to the opening. And these are tensions that are always going to be hard to hold on to, about gender, about kind of bodies, about germs, right? They're always going to be hard to hold on to here. But all of these things, you know, are the kind of multi-pronged kind of impetus for a massive public spending campaign. And it's massive, a massive public spending campaign on bathrooms. This is one of, actually, I should say, the benefits of the research I'm doing. This can't, you know, this isn't New York. This is not, you know, Chicago. This is not Los Angeles. This is York, Pennsylvania, Denton, Texas, Columbus, Georgia. They are all involved in this project to build public bathrooms. And so it's a project in a kind of scope that isn't just about the largest cities in America. It is very much about small and medium-sized cities as well. And they share something in common, and that is a kind of, if there's a multi-pronged impetus, there's a multi-pronged framing of the theme of protection that will be used to justify the expense of building public bathrooms, right? And that expense thing is something we'll keep coming back to. And so, the first thing that people are kind of interested in is, right, providing a kind of clean space. So a lot of emphasis on cleanliness, on safety, on public health. There's lots of Mary Douglas here, right, about fears of disorder, right? And so this is one of the reasons for justifying this kind of spending. So a lot of talk that you have to build public bathrooms for women. Now, there had been resistance to this, right? And it's the resistance you can imagine. There's resistance in London, there's resistance in New York to building public bathrooms for women because men say, look, that will justify their kind of occupation of public space. But eventually, the kind of argument wins out that we need to build public bathrooms in order to protect women in public. And this is a really interesting argument because it once sort of allows women the leverage to be in public, but at the same time sort of casts them as frail and in some ways in need of places of respite. And so it's a kind of double-pronged kind of assertion. So there's again, we have to build public bathrooms. We have to fund these. We need to provide spaces for women when they're in public, but we need to do so because of very specific ideas about gender and about women. Another kind of protection that's put in place is the public bathroom intersects with the rise of the temperance movement in the United States. And essentially, right, you have this kind of developing urbanism, developing kind of public sphere, the separation of work and home. Men need public bathrooms as well. But there are, in a sense, semi-public bathrooms for men that exist. They're bars. And there's a very broad and far-reaching campaign to build public bathrooms to keep men out of the saloon. The idea is that men need to go use the bathroom and they buy a drink and they just never leave. They spend all the family's wages, right? And so this is, again, they're protecting men from the saloon. And the last thing is that there's a real sense, particularly in small towns, of the need to build public bathrooms in order to compete with other small towns to get business. In other words, if you have a town here and there's like small towns around it and there's another town here, they're in competition with each other. And the one says, we can get more of this rural business if we build a public bathroom. If we're inviting people to use our city for the day, we need to provide them with this kind of option. And this is actually, again, one of these kind of impetuses for building public bathrooms in smaller or medium-sized towns. So you have this kind of, again, this kind of very strong effort, right, to build public bathrooms in the 1890s. And again, what I want to stress here is the willingness to actually spend a fair amount of money on these places. And what municipalities say when they build these bathrooms is they say they need to build them for people. But I think the thing that's really interesting, and I want you to kind of go back in your head to that St. Louis bathroom, is they brag all the time about how ornate they are. They brag about their marble finishes. They brag about the copper piping. They brag about the modern, up-to-date plumbing. And they brag about their ability to serve the public. And I think this is really, again, this is a really kind of interesting and kind of massive infusion of capital into kind of creating access for people to the public, and people are proud of it. And in some cases, they even say that the bathroom is the best case to be made for public spending. They say, if we want to build roads, if we want to build new museums, if we want to build bridges, we should build bathrooms first because it will prove to people that the state can matter in their lives. So kind of another interesting kind of side argument here. So just talk about some of the kind of initial contradictions again, you have this kind of massive investment in public bathrooms. You can see it in this, public bathrooms, pretty ornate building. But a couple of things. This is built from the very beginning as segregated on sex lines, men's rooms and women's rooms, a kind of definition, a kind of protection for women against men, a protection for men against women and menstruation and other things, right? There's all kinds of talk about this, right? But again, a massive investment in creating separateness. And at the same time, almost everywhere, and this is not just a Southern phenomenon, and this is, again, something that's kind of reflected in historiography in the US, they're built racially segregated, right? There are Black and white bathrooms, North and South, right? And this, I think, is a really interesting one in the South. White people are entitled to sex segregation, but people of color, Black people, are not, right? But these public bathrooms are incredible public projects, but public projects from the very beginning that have contradictions and sort of tensions and separateness built into them, right? And in fact, they wouldn't be built if they didn't have these separations. So one other thing I want to say about this, because this is going to turn to the pivot, is, and this is back to this Victorian thing. So many of the early public bathrooms in the United States, and there's a lot of postcards of these, if anyone's also interested in like the work of Alison Eisenberg, who sort of points out the kind of utility of the postcard as a source. The bathrooms are almost always underground, and they're almost always out of the way. And this is an important part of this dynamic. This was the squeamishness about people engaging in very private acts in public. The idea that you would need to put these kinds of spaces in ways and places where people couldn't see them and couldn't see people entering them. Again, the idea of protecting people's privacy in public. So this is my pivot point that I want to, just for today, to talk about. I'm moving to a second part of the fall part. And this happens exactly around this tension between the public and the private in these massive public investments in bathrooms. Again, the public bathroom is built in a kind of out of the way place. And what happens almost immediately is people who do not have enough privacy in their lives, who do not have access to the kind of privacy that they need, turn to the public bathroom as a kind of place that they can use, a kind of privacy in public. So people who don't have kind of modern plumbing will turn to them. People without houses will turn to them. People who want to do drugs will turn to them. And most importantly, probably, people who want to have sex with people of the same sex turn to them. Men, particularly, who want to have sex with men, turn to the public bathroom almost immediately. This is not like some lag time here. This is, public bathrooms were built in the 1890s. By the late 1890s, public officials are already noticing that they have become places for same-sex assignation. And as a Baltimore official will later say, and I just read this quote because it's important, right? Because of the privacy requirements of the bathroom, it becomes, he writes, a haven for all kinds of nefarious activities. So beginning in the 1930s, the same language of protection gets used as a way to actually close the public bathroom. Public officials are no longer bragging about building ornate public bathrooms. They're talking about closing them down to protect the right kind of people. And so that pivot, right, protection remains the constant. Well, the outcome of that protection is going to shift, is sort of what my piles are telling me so far. And so I think we see something really interesting beginning in the 1930s, and I think this date's important. And I don't know how much I want to stick to this, and it'd be interesting to talk about. Often the retreat from the public in the United States is really talked about as happening in the 1950s. I'm really talking about as a response to kind of the breakdown of segregation in housing and stuff like that. I actually think maybe it happens earlier, and it maybe is about the breakdown of kind of heteronormative sexual spaces. And so there might be something to kind of to talk about there. But the second part of this book that I'm imagining is the period after this, right? A fall kind of narrative. And what's happening again is bathrooms are closed, but that doesn't mean people don't need them, right? And then I think this is an important thing. You know, the public still depends, right, on access to a bathroom. That point, and what you see, I think, happening from the 1930s forward is a lot of the kind of things that we associate with the neoliberal city can be showcased and sort of made clear by thinking about the public bathroom. And so just a couple of things I'm thinking about for this second part of my book about this closed part. So again, the first thing is the shutting down, right, of public spaces to protect the right people from the wrong people. This is a kind of global phenomenon, right, of the neoliberal era, right, of sorting out of the right and wrong people who are worthy of public investment. But again, right, people need bathrooms. And so the first thing that happens throughout this period is really the outsourcing of public functions. Increasingly, and had happened before the public bathroom was built, people rely on private solutions to what was once defined as a public function. In other words, they rely on restaurants, hotels, and increasingly Starbucks, right, for this right to a public function. And again, we can talk about the consequences of that, but I think we can see with the bathroom is that there's the outsourcing again of public functions. A second thing you can see really with bathrooms is self-funding. Again, another classic kind of trait of neoliberalism, right? If you want a function, you should pay for it yourself. Highways in the United States is a classic example of this, right? That the way in which people are being forced, right, and in a kind of downward, basically distribution of wealth, they're being forced to pay for public functions. Well, in the case of the public bathroom, really between the 1930s and the 1970s, you have the advent of the pay toilet, which is a little bit more common in Europe, right? But was a kind of uncommon and sort of ugly kind of manifestation of this in the United States. This picture on the right, anyone sort of my age, right, would remember this of like trying to fumble around for a dime to put in this. There's all kinds of inequities here because between men and women, we can talk about this, but it's again, an example of self-funding. The ultimate kind of self-funding project actually is from a French company, J.C. Decaux, who eventually tries to pay for bathrooms in New York City in exchange for using them as advertising space, right? Again, a classic kind of neoliberal manifestation. The other, I think, way that this works is disinvestment and neglect, right? And what happens is, first of all, the kind of public bathroom becomes a much more utilitarian space when it even exists, right? There's no more sort of honoring the public with beautiful kind of finishing points. It becomes, you know, chrome, steel, cheapest linoleum possible, right? But also then investment in that is neglected, and then the people who need them are blamed for the neglect of that space, right? And then therefore you say they're not worthy of our investment. Again, another kind of classic kind of neoliberal kind of way in which citizenship and responsibility get folded back in a way that they disadvantage the most vulnerable who need the public. And the last thing I think that happens in this, what I would imagine is the second half of my book about decline, is something that will carry through from both parts. Is I think that the public bathroom, the closing of the public bathroom, is used to disappear people. And I'll use a couple of examples of this. It clearly is the first response to the breakdown of segregation in the South and the North is to bar Black people from public bathrooms in workplaces and in public itself. And in a sense was trying to make it so that they couldn't challenge segregation. In the 1980s, the United States, as a result of Reagan's politics, has a kind of new and very visible homeless problem that kind of manifests itself in a way that Americans hadn't seen before. And the response of public officials is to ban public urination. not to invest in bathrooms, right? And in a sense, this was the policy that Giuliani pursued. You disappear people. Somehow, if you eliminate their ability to actually function, they will disappear. Same with trans people, same with people with physical challenges, right? So all of these ways of the kind of decline is a kind of process of disappearing. I've been thinking about in recent years. So again, just evidence of this fall, I think that as dramatic as it can get, New York City in 1950 had 1,600 public bathrooms. In 2010, there were 51, and I suspect most people wouldn't use many of these public bathrooms. That neglect principle as well. But this is a fundamental like covering up of what used to be, right? And also of a kind of rearrangement of this space. So let me just shift gears for a second and admit that this is a part of the manuscript I'm not totally sure what I'm going to do with yet and how it fits with the rise and fall sections. But one of the other really big piles and subpiles of my research so far, and Andrew, am I all right for time? I got about 5 more minutes. Is that cool? Yeah, is the idea is the bathroom is a site of protest. And this is really interesting. I mean, I think it makes sense, but I think it hasn't been written about and talked about enough. So actually, the very first, this is from the Freedom Rides. And actually, the first time John Lewis really gets beat up is in trying to integrate a white bathroom as part of the Freedom Rides. And the civil rights movement had always made the bathroom a really principal kind of place that it was going to contest Jim Crow because it understood the power of that site. And we see this kind of almost every social movement of the 20th century has a bathroom component to it. The women's movement, this is a California state congressperson who is smashing a toilet, arguing about the principle of potty parity. In other words, that women in public often face longer lines, less bathrooms, and therefore like some real challenges, right? And they're contesting, they would say this is the last part of the civil rights movement, right? To kind of have equality of access to the public means truly equal kind of bathroom access, which in the case of women, they would argue means more toilets actually available. But again, they're making, there's a playfulness to this, but they're making a really kind of important argument about public services and access to the public. This is actually one of my favorite ones. There was a group of kind of late 1960s. They were kind of new left group who started the Stamp Out Pay Toilets in kind of tying into the bicentennial in the United States. But again, they were making an argument about women's rights, that the pay toilet was something that actually, again, put women in a kind of limited their access to the public. Andrew, one kind of interesting, Mayor Daley was an early supporter of the elimination of pay toilets in a kind of, they got him along, and he was one of the first people to really sort of kind of support this at O'Hare and Midway airports in particular. But also this would become a really important site in the gay rights movement, actually even before, for instance, Stonewall. One of the ways that gay men or men who wanted to have sex with men who met in bathrooms were actually persecuted was through surveillance, through entrapment and arrests. And as early as 1964 and 1965, early gay rights activists are meeting with police trying to end this kind of surveillance because the consequences were dire, right? They would publish your name in the paper if you were caught having sex with a man at a public bathroom. And this entrapment silenced people. And so again, one of the kind of, again, early pre-Stonewall manifestations of gay rights is a real struggle over kind of this surveillance. Even before the ADA, ableist activists, right, are fighting for rights to a bathroom, understanding, right, that the construction of a bathroom in public limited their ability to have access to the public. And again, most kind of forcefully in recent years has been the trans rights movement in this country, which has really challenged one, sex segregation at the bathroom door, violence in bathrooms, and have sort of really brought a whole range of issues of rights and access to the public at the bathroom door. And I'll talk about the opposition to this in a second. One other thing that I have a pile, and I'm kind of curious what I'm going to do with is, but also is what to do with graffiti, for instance. The bathroom as a place of kind of protest, like written protest, kind of playing off the the private and public nature of the very space, right? That you can hide what you write and your sort of ideas, but know that someone will read them in that space. And I saw an interesting manifestation of this at Temple before the COVID shutdown. Temple, for the most part, it's in Philadelphia, as you know, the heroic city and the Biden victory. But Temple is a largely kind of liberal, progressive campus. There's not a lot of public kind of support for Donald Trump. And one of the things I would notice in the bathroom from 2016 to now is that's the one place I saw pro-Trump stuff, right? So it was basically the privacy of the bathroom. Oh, I think some Temple students allowed them to say what they felt like they couldn't say in public. So I'm just kind of thinking through some of this graffiti stuff. There's some literature on it about, the difference between men's and women's rooms, what people write. So something I'm not totally, these are like things I don't know where to fit. We'll just get down to the present, back to Starbucks for a second. And I would say, right, if we take ourselves up to kind of the recent present, right, the retreat of the state and of the government from building public bathrooms and really public solutions, right, has meant essentially kind of new divisions. Again, we can new authority, right, for the people who work at Starbucks to control access to that, and new abilities to kind of racially profile and create differences. And so that the semi-public, the kind of closing of the bathroom, right, is a kind of doubling down on exclusions, I would argue, in the United States. And evidence would suggest this, right? My own research would suggest this. Other evidence about who has access to a bathroom would suggest this. So let me end with two last points, and that is there's a kind of, I think in recent years, been a kind of interesting move to build public bathrooms. And this does kind of harken back to my theme about protection. Again and again, cities led by business leaders frustrated with having to provide their own bathrooms to the public, particularly restaurant owners, have urged municipalities to build bathrooms. And they have urged them to build bathrooms in order to compete for business. And the argument, they literally use the word protection. We need to build a bathroom in order to protect ourselves, protect our business, to attract visitors. And in the kind of, manifestation of the city as a tourist economy, which might not be true after COVID, right? And the kind of leisure space, the public bathroom is gaining kind of new currency as a strategy to win over tourists. And so this is actually the beach town that I go to, Ventnor, New Jersey, which just spent somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of $750,000 to build a public bathroom on a pier. And they did it. They said, we need to spend this money so people don't leak another. Sorry, that's a bad to the next town down the street. Now, whether this will survive COVID, I have no idea, because there's a lot of COVID articles, right, about the closing down again of public bathrooms, whatever exists, and even of semi-public bathrooms. There's a whole legal question that's going to be kind of worked out in the United States, where if you, I don't know, used a bathroom in an establishment and claim that you got COVID, I don't know how that would happen actually. You could sue them. So there's a kind of put COVID as a brake mechanism might be one of my postscripts. So let me just talk about a couple other areas of study, and then I'll be done and happy to take questions. Things that actually I have piles for and don't know where to put, in other words, right? Going back to my pile metaphor. I don't really know what to do with the comparative dimensions of this project. Um, I kind of hate comparative history personally. What often happens is someone says, well, we do this in Paris, and we end up with the conclusion that Paris is different from New York. But we kind of knew that already, right? Or at least at some level already knew that. But there are some really interesting comparative dimensions. The one that I am kind of most interested in right now is why American bathrooms have such short doors as compared to other parts of the world. When did that happen? How do you do research about questions like that, about the physical spaces of these places? I mean, I have some ideas, but literally like how the bathrooms are built, I'm really kind of interested in. Another thing I am really interested in and trying to find a place for is that I think that, well, the public bathroom kind of the commitment of officials to build public bathrooms declines, the symbolic power of the bathroom kind of increases. And I think we can see this really in the United States in the 1970s, for instance, when the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, and it was beaten back by an anti-feminist challenge led by Phyllis Schlafly. And one of her really crucial arguments was that if the Constitution protected women's rights, there would no longer be sex segregation in bathrooms. She was really making a kind of case for a kind of much less fluid kind of gender lines, and actually making an analogy to segregation and the kind of troubles, as she saw it, that desegregation brought. There's some good stuff about this in this Hulu documentary, Mrs. America, that appeared, I guess, a year ago. But I'm kind of trying to think about that. I'm also thinking about the bathroom as a place of liberation, particularly kind of in the gay rights movement and kind of ideas about sexuality. My former colleague at Temple, Samuel Delaney wrote a fair amount about this, right? Celebrating, right, kind of bathroom sex. There was an exhibit in Berlin that did a similar thing. And I'm trying to think about the bathroom as a site of liberation, what to do with that. And then the last thing I would say, a kind of short note about the literature. There's a fair amount of sociological literature on the bathroom, even enough that there's a small field of toilet studies. There's almost no historians have written about it. There's nothing about kind of change over time. And so there's a lot of space to write here, which is both good and, well, bad, right? There's not a lot to bounce up against for this project, but again, it's worth noting there is a kind of pretty decent literature from sociology, and you can imagine there's lots of things you can study from a sociological perspective, and I've learned a lot from that. But there's very little kind of on the history of the public bathroom, so that's to me a little bit of a problem, right? There's not a lot for me to bounce up against. There's not a lot of shortcuts I can take. I have to kind of do most of this research on my own.